90% of global demands for phosphorus is for food production. Feeding the world requires large amounts of fertilizer, of which phosphorus is a major component. New Zealand's dependency on its agricultural industry is also what's driving natural phosphate extraction and exploitation in the Pacific Islands and in Western Sahara. This dark part of New Zealand's colonial history and contemporary trade policy has often been swept under the rug, or rather buried underneath New Zealand's flourishing green pastures. With the country's ambition to be the food basket of the world, phosphorus imports have been a major drive of New Zealand's agricultural boom, which provides the backbone of its economy. Without large imports of phosphorus, New Zealand's nutrient-deficient soils would not yield near as much as they do today. As a colonial power, New Zealand exploited Pacific islands such as Banaba Island in today's Kiribati, where 90% of the island's surface were mined by the British Phosphate Commission, jointly owned by the British, Australian, and the New Zealand government from the early 1900s to the end of the 1970s. This extractive and exploitative practice left behind barren land, uninhabitable for local people, and led to the forced resettlement of Banabans to Rabai Island in Fiji, making them landless and stripped of their ancestral ties. The Banabans are an indigenous group with a distinct culture and one of the few ethnicities in the Pacific that had individual ownership of land. This made it easier for the colonial mining company to dispossess individual landowners. Occasional uprisings by the few remaining Banabans were quickly suppressed by the colonial powers. After their land was destroyed, Western colonizers handed the island over to newly independent Kiribati in 1979 in disregard of Banaba's pre-colonial independent status. Hence, the Banabans lost their territorial sovereignty to Kiribati. To this day, Banabans in Fiji are regarded as second-class citizens without ownership rights to the land they occupy. Banaban scholars and activists have described this deep experience of grief and loss by their people. As Teresia Taua has written in her powerful essay about the Banabans' loss of their land, if Banabans think of their blood and land as one and the same, it follows then that in losing their land, they lost their blood. In losing their phosphate to agriculture, they have spilled their blood in different lands. Their essential route on Ocean Island are now essentially routes to other places. Hele Christopher Ikumotu, a Banaban youth worker for a Pacific NGO in New Zealand, expressed his grief in a similar way. My people's blood and bones are on the land I live on now. New Zealand was able to prosper at the expense of remote islands. This has been little known bloodstain on New Zealand's history. With the depletion of phosphate resources in the Pacific, New Zealand has turned to other sources. Morocco sits on large phosphorus reserves, which gives them strong control of this lucrative global trade. Yet their claims to these reserves are highly contested, as this occurred through land grabbing in Western Sahara, which Morocco claims as their own territory, dismissing indigenous Sahrawis' claims to the land. Western Sahara was annexed by Morocco in 1975, and the Sahrawis were sent into exile and continue to live in Algerian refugee camps dependent on foreign aid or in the unforgiving desert of Western Sahara. Their claims that Morocco is breaking international law by extracting and exploiting phosphate have been largely ignored by the international community, even though they don't recognize Morocco as the sovereign in Western Sahara. Human rights as well as the autonomy and sovereignty of Sahrawis continues to be violated. While most countries in the global north have stopped phosphorus imports from this conflict region, New Zealand is the last Western democracy to source blood phosphate from Western Sahara. New Zealand currently sources over 80% of its phosphorus imports from this contested region, while claiming that it is legally sourced. New Zealand's practice has come under increased scrutiny and has garnered global criticism as it ignores the ethical implications of this contentious trade and the human rights infringements that are associated with it. The New Zealand government should honor its extraterritorial human rights obligations, which means that they should not allow corporate practices of its own companies that cause human rights violations in overseas territories. The sustained policy inaction of the New Zealand government, where foreign trade in commodities is essentially left to a neoliberal regime of supply and demand, needs to stop. The government could either ban all imports of phosphorus and other natural resources from conflict regions or impose prohibitively high import taxes on such resources. By continuing to allow such unethical import practices, the New Zealand government puts its own national economic interests over the respect for international human rights, which is immoral and detrimental to New Zealand's claim of being a force for humanity and peace.